Okay, just a little bit about hip structure in your snake creeps down posture. Okay, anyone who knows anything about the human anatomy will know that it's not very good for you to do box splits out this way. Your hip kind of looks roughly like that. There's your leg bone, your ball joint, and your hip goes in like that. Okay, you're going to do the box splits. What's going to happen? The leg's going out, 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 out. Look where the ball joint is. It's almost falling out of the joint to be able to get your leg to go like that. So it's not very healthy for your hips. You're putting pressure on the joints as opposed to just stretching the muscles themselves. Whereas move your leg this way, and the ball joint's just swiveling in there. So that's fine. That's forward and backward motion. So when we do our snake creeps down posture, we're actually moving the hip joint. So there's the hip like that. There's my hip and there's my leg going in there. So that's the top of my leg, assuming I'm facing like that. So the leg is not going to go at 90 degrees. It's not going to go this way, straight forward. It's going to go kind of that way, out to the corner. So you're sort of going in between the two in your snake creeps down posture. So to explain this with the actual hips, you can stretch in all different ways, of course. There's nothing wrong with, okay, for example, if I stretch like this way, that's my hips are on the front and my leg is going directly out at 90 degrees. So that's stretching directly on the inside of the thigh. If you're tight in there, then of course, by all means, stretch that area out. I'm not saying don't move your legs this way. Just don't move them past your natural hip structure. Having said that, your natural hip structure, every single person will vary. You can have some people who can maybe kind of just about get to their box splits. I still personally wouldn't advise it, but because of their hip structure, they can do it okay-ish without putting their bodies under huge pressure and harm. However, most people can't, and some people have, it's physically impossible. So for example, there's your femur, I think it's called, your leg bone. There's your angle, right, of your ball joint. Some people's angles are like that, in which case if you do the box splits, your ball joint's no longer in the socket. It's just physically not in there anymore. Some people's angles, though, will vary. They might go up to here. So now I can get to there and still have it, you know, it's still going to be on the edge. It's still going to be putting a lot of pressure on it, but it'll still at least be in the joint. So that's what I'm saying. It's still in a very vulnerable position, which I wouldn't advocate putting yourself in. It's a very unnatural thing to put your legs out like that. This way, your legs are designed to move that way to a larger degree. But this way, they're just designed for minimal degree. So anyway, when we're moving the hip joint, I always see people, and if they can do the box splits, they assume everyone else can. And they just keep stretching, push your body through it. You just got to work through it. It's not a matter of working through it. It's a matter of the physicality that your bones are shaped like this. And if you bend your bones to that direction, your hip will fall out. The ball joint will fall out of the socket. So you cannot do box splits if you have that kind of hip structure. There's nothing you can do about it. Okay, so just how the hip works. Okay, watch. If I go down like this, okay, so that there, because I've got my hips on the front and the leg in that position, like that, that's my hip going at 90 degrees. So I can go to a certain degree before I get pressure on the hip. So I can go down to about there. If I keep my hips, if I do this, I can go further, but now I'm leaning forward, of course. If I keep my hips flat, I can go to about there before I start feeling pressure in here. So I'm not feeling pressure on the muscles. If you're feeling pressure here on the big muscle in between your hip and your knee, well then that's fine. You're just stretching the muscle. So you want to push yourself to get that muscle nice and flexible. However, you don't want to go so flexible that your muscles can no longer protect your hip. If your muscle in here gets so flexible, then when you go to this and you do a stretch like this, the muscle's so flexible that you're going to put all the pressure on the joint itself. So if I go to there, that's okay. And I have actually made that mistake myself. I've gone too flexible in here, so I'm stopping to stretch in here myself nowadays. it doesn't cause me any problems. It's just something I have to be aware of myself, because if I were to go in this position and just think, okay, just drop violently into that position, I'd put a lot of pressure on my hip joint. Whereas if I still had tension in the muscle, when I drop, the tension in the muscle would catch your body. So you'd just be sat there in the tension of the muscle rather than putting pressure on the hip joint. But my muscles are so flexible now that my hip joint wants to just go all the way. So I go to here, and straight away I feel pressure right there in the side of the hip. So if you're feeling pressure anywhere right there in the side of your hip, that means you don't want to go past that point. You want to lift it up from that point. So I can bend to there. That's with the hips here. If I turn the hip to 45 degrees, so the leg now is at 45 degrees as opposed to 90, like that. Now I can go a little bit further before getting pressure in the hip. So that now, rather than going this way, so I've gone there, I've gone like that. So I've gone slightly towards the front, or towards the rear in this case. So from there, now I've turned the hip in a little bit. I can go to about there comfortably. Past that, now then I start to feel the pressure in the hip. That's where you don't want to feel it. So again, don't go lower than when you feel pressure in your own hip. And again, that's going to vary person to person as to your own hip structure. So I know for me, I don't want to go past here, because if I go to there, I feel the pressure in the hip, and that's what I don't want to feel. That's bad for your body. And then of course the full extreme is if you turn the hip right over to 90 degrees, like that. Well, now I can go as far as my muscles will let me. Now see, I feel the pressure all here in that big muscle on the front, and that's what's holding me in that position. There's no pressure in the hip whatsoever, because the hip joint itself is moving this way now to its full range of motion, which is forward and backwards. So the hip is just rotating, the ball joint is rotating within the socket. It's not coming out of the socket at all. So if you go to that full 90 degree, yeah, you can't, I mean, if you're really flexible, maybe you could go to the point where you'd put pressure on the hip again, but not many people are going to be that flexible. So yeah, basically there now, you can sink right down as far as you want, and that's just putting pressure on the muscle, not on the hip. Okay, so that's how the hip works. So when we do our snake creeps down, our snake creeps down posture has that angled position, the 45. It's not the full 180, it's certainly not the 90, it's in the middle, or 135. Okay, so when we do snake creeps down, as you should know, your rear foot faces to the corner. So you've come out, see, single whip. Your rear foot turns 90 degrees so that it's facing the corner. And then your front foot swivels on the toe to there, so it's pointing directly to the north. So you've got corner and front, like that. Now what you have to be careful of is, with that foot positioning, what a lot of people make the mistake of is this. When they come into their single whip, if you take a correct single whip stance, which looks like that, which is just slightly narrower than your natural shoulder width, so it's like that. Okay, if I do that now, turn my foot out, push this heel out, see how far the feet are apart. Because I've swiveled on the heel, not on the toe, it's pushed the leg even further out to this direction. So see how far the feet are apart now. So now, with that angle, if my hips are on the front, which they should be, to the north, when I go down, see, that leg's going out to the rear, like that. So I've got that 135 degree angle. There's 180, it's just there like that. But the mistake people will make is they'll come into their single whip trying to get a longer stance, and they'll go like this. So see, now it's a narrow, very narrow stance for the single whip. If you go down into snake creeps down now with the same foot alignment, so this foot on the rear and this foot on the front, now when I go down, you see the leg is pointing straight to the front. It's not going to the rear. Therefore, the angle of your hip is now at 90 degrees, not at that 135, which is what we want. So now I can only do my snake creeps down to there. Otherwise, I'm going to put pressure on the hip. Or I could fold the hip forward, which would allow me to go into the posture correctly. However, if I fold the hip forward, of course, like that, now see my posture wants to be over here. I can't bring my body back to the front as it should be. So your snake creeps down posture, you need to take your step correctly. So you've got that width here between your heels. You can shuffle your foot out if you need to, like that. You push the heel out. Now, with the hips here, I can now twist from the upper. Now I can do my snake creeps down and have my intention to the front without putting that pressure in there. That's the most important lesson here, is that if you feel pressure right in the top of the hip there, you're doing something wrong. That's the first well, that's what I feel anyway. That's the first pressure that I feel if I go too low. Again, with reference to the hip, if you look up, just type in hip joint or something on Google Images, and you'll see some images of what the hip joint looks like. But basically, there's your leg bone, as I said before, and there's the ball joint, and there's the hip socket. It goes in like that. But there's also another little knobbly bit that comes off here, like that. So when this bends like this, before the joint even comes out, this knobbly bit here is going to push like that against the top of the hip bone. So you're getting this bone on bone crushing sensation. And that's what I get here in the side of my hip if I go too low, because as I said, I've made my muscles too flexible for certain postures. So I have to consciously hold myself up rather than going too low. So yeah, as I say, if you're going at 90 degrees, that bone on bone, that's the top of the bone here pushing into the top of the hip bone. And that's what we want to stop happening. So only go, just, do it yourself, go, okay, oh yeah, okay, I can feel that if you're really flexible as well. And go, okay, just come just up from that position, and that's where you want to be holding your snake creeps down. Another tip about snake creeps down, of course, is that regardless of how flexible you are, even if you have amazing hip joints that are super, super bendy and you can bend yourself into any which way, snake creeps down still, you should be holding yourself in the posture. See, I can go like this. See, now I'm just sunk, like I'm just slack in the posture. I don't want to be like that. I want to be like that. I want to be like held in the posture. It's about being strong. Snake creeps down, yes, it works on your flexibility to some degree, of course, but the primary thing about snake creeps down is actually training your strength, not your flexibility. Most people I know who can't do snake creeps down, it's not because they're not flexible enough, it's because they're not strong enough. The core muscles, the muscles in here, are not physically strong enough to hold them up. What will usually happen is they'll be going into the posture and they'll start leaning forward, because it's very easy to hold a posture like that when you're leaning forward on the leg, or even just leaning forward a little bit. You must keep your body totally upright when you go into your snake creeps down position, like that. Twist from here. That's difficult. It's hard for me to hold that. If I go like that, see, now I'm letting my hip, I'm sort of sinking into my hip. Now I'm just sitting there. It's kind of like the same principle of, okay, if I do that, if you can see what my hip's doing, if I stand like this, I'm standing with good posture, good structure in the hips. Now, see, I've stuck my hip out, I'm allowing all the pressure to just sit in that hip, rather than now I'm engaging. So it's the same thing with your snake creeps down. I can go to there and just, now it's just here that's holding me in place. Now, this is engaged, that's holding me up, like that. This is pushing a little bit. All these muscles are working in my body to hold me in that stance and train those muscles. And that's what we want to get out of our snake creeps down. It's about muscular strengthening, not so much about flexibility. Okay, thank you.